England, 1825. Some debts cost more than money. Some steal years, silence, and the careful distance between two people who once promised each other everything. The morning Catherine Ashworth arrived at Ravensfield Manor, the Yorkshire sky hung grey and heavy with the weight of spring rain. Her travelling carriage, worn from months of European roads, rolled through gates framed by iron lions whose gilded paint had long since surrendered to the elements. She smoothed the fabric of her charcoal travelling dress, a garment chosen deliberately, expensive enough to command respect from household staff, modest enough to suggest financial constraint. At 32 years of age, Catherine had learned the language of clothing as carefully as she had learned French and Italian during her decade abroad. The manor itself rose before her in all its architectural authority, a sprawling testament to generations of wealth and accumulated power. Ravensfield possessed the kind of beauty that intimidated rather than welcomed. All soaring windows and limestone facades, surrounded by lawns that seemed to stretch toward infinity. Catherine had visited this place once, long ago, when the world felt different and possibility still inhabited her chest like something warm and alive. She did not allow herself to contemplate that memory beyond a passing acknowledgement that it existed. A footman descended from the carriage to retrieve her traveling trunks, an older man with the bearing of someone who had managed such tasks for decades. His expression remained neutral, which Catherine found marginally preferable to the alternative. She had been gone a very long time. The ton likely remembered her as the daughter of Viscount Ashworth, the young woman who had failed to secure a respectable match and subsequently vanished. By now, she suspected, she had become something closer to furniture in their collective memory, functional but unimportant. "Miss Ashworth, I presume?" A voice emerged from within the manor before she had fully ascended the stone steps. The butler, Bennett, if her memory served, presented himself with the formal courtesy of his station. "His Grace is expecting you in the library, if you would follow me." Ashworth had advanced the money to smother a rumor poised to name Ravensfield among distressed estates facing a mortgage auction. He chose discretion over signatures and expected nothing except the preservation of a man's remaining dignity. Catherine's pulse quickened, though she kept her breathing steady. Of course he was expecting her. She had sent word 3 weeks prior through her solicitor, Timothy Vance, requesting an audience regarding a matter of significant financial importance. She had not dared specify the nature of her visit. Some information she had learned required the formality of proximity to be properly conveyed. The library at Ravensfield Manor existed in her memory as a room of profound silence. Towering shelves that seemed to absorb sound before it could fully form. Tall windows that admitted the kind of light that made dust motes visible and everything else somehow less real. It had not changed substantially, though the leather armchairs seemed more worn now, and a certain accumulation of solitude permeated the air like the scent of old paper and neglect. He stood with his back to the door, silhouetted against the afternoon light streaming through the western windows. James Whitmore, the Duke of Ravensfield, had aged in the 10 years since she had last seen him. There were threads of silver at his temples now, and his shoulders carried themselves with a tension that spoke of burdens borne alone. He did not turn immediately when she entered, as though he could not quite compel his body to perform the social grace of recognition. When he finally turned, Catherine witnessed the precise moment understanding crystallized in his expression. His dark eyes, which she remembered as capable of remarkable warmth, had become something closer to slate, all hardness and impenetrable distance. The features of his face, still bearing the angular precision that had made him the object of considerable attention from London's marriage-minded families, seemed to have calcified into something more forbidding than handsome. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and the tone of his voice suggested he had confirmed something unpleasant rather than greeted an acquaintance. He did not move toward her. He did not offer his hand. He simply stood in that shaft of golden light, regarding her with an expression that managed to be simultaneously acknowledging and dismissive. "Your Grace," Catherine responded, offering the curtsy that protocol demanded. She held it longer than strictly necessary, using the moment to compose her features into the mask of professional courtesy she had perfected over years of necessity. When she rose, she found him still watching her with that unsettling intensity. Thank you for receiving me on such short notice. I understand you are a man of considerable obligations. The letter from your solicitor suggested a matter of significant urgency. He moved toward the mahogany desk that dominated one side of the library, his movements controlled and measured. I confess I anticipated something different. The implication hung between them, that he had expected someone else, something else, anything other than her. Catherine refused to acknowledge the small wound his tone inflicted. I have come regarding an outstanding matter of financial obligation, one that concerns both our families, though the connection may not be immediately apparent to you. His jaw tightened fractionally. Then perhaps you should explain it to me, Miss Ashworth. I find I am most receptive when information is conveyed with clarity rather than circumspection. Catherine moved forward, not toward the chair he had gestured toward, but toward the window where she could see the gardens of Ravensfield spread beneath the clearing sky. The rain had stopped, and sunlight was beginning to break through the dissipating clouds in those golden columns that suggested divine intervention rather than meteorological inevitability. "My father," she began, her voice steady and devoid of the tremor that wanted to emerge, "passed away 6 months ago. During the settling of his estate, my solicitor discovered documentation regarding a loan extended to this property, approximately 10 years prior. The loan was apparently unsecured and bore accumulated interest. The documents suggest that neither the principal nor the accruing interest has been addressed." Behind her, she heard the subtle shift of his weight, the sharp intake of breath that suggested she had managed to surprise him. Good. Surprise was preferable to the cold dismissal she had been bracing herself against. "Your father made me a loan?" His tone carried genuine incredulity. "I have no recollection of such an arrangement." "He did not." Catherine turned from the window to face him directly. "He offered assistance during a period when you required it. The documentation I possess indicates that the offer was not accepted at the time. However, the funds were apparently transferred regardless, through intermediaries, with the understanding that repayment would occur once circumstances improved." She paused, allowing the weight of that implication to settle between them. "The circumstances, Your Grace, have improved considerably for Ravensfield. My circumstances have become considerably more complicated." He studied her in the way one might study a mathematical equation that refused to resolve into sense. "You are suggesting that your father gave me money I did not request and did not accept. I am suggesting that my father acted from conviction rather than expectation of return. He was a man who believed in the importance of assisting those he considered worthy of assistance, particularly when that assistance might prevent public humiliation." Catherine clasped her hands before her, a gesture of composure rather than supplication. "His son never recovered from the injury to his own reputation that resulted from his gesture on your behalf." The Duke's expression shifted into something Catherine could not quite parse. Anger, perhaps, or remorsefulness, or some complicated mixture of both that his features were not quite adequate to convey. He turned back to his desk, sorting through papers with a precision that suggested he was not actually searching for anything, but rather avoiding the necessity of response. "What do you propose, Miss Ashworth?" His voice had dropped into a register of controlled civility that suggested immense effort. "I cannot pay you compensation for a debt I did not accrue. To do so would be to validate a premise I do not accept." Catherine drew upon every resource of dignity she possessed. "I am not requesting compensation. I am requesting employment. I require a position managing one of your rural properties, a role that would provide sufficient income to sustain myself, independent of charity or the limited options available to unmarried women of uncertain social standing. In exchange, the financial obligation documented in my father's papers will be considered settled in full." The silence that followed was profound enough to contain the weight of 10 years of absence, unspoken history, and all the words that had never quite found their way into utterance. "You are offering to exchange your labor for debts paid to a man who is no longer in a position to claim otherwise," he finally said. It was not a question. "I am offering a transaction that benefits us both," Catherine corrected softly. "You gain a competent administrator for properties you clearly do not have adequate supervision for, based on the condition of the grounds I observed upon my arrival. I gain stability and the ability to maintain modest independence. My father's name is cleared of any suggestion of manipulation or impropriety. Everyone involved achieves a resolution that requires nothing beyond the practical." He regarded her for a long moment, and in that moment, Catherine saw something shift behind the hardness of his gaze. Not warmth, she was not so foolish as to hope for that, but perhaps recognition. Perhaps acknowledgement that she was a woman of calculation and pragmatism rather than sentimentality, and that such qualities might possess their own form of value. "Very well," he said quietly. "We will proceed as you have outlined." The library of Ravensfield Manor became Catherine's sanctuary during those first days of employment, though she would have disputed the characterization if asked. A sanctuary implied refuge, and her presence here was anything but peaceful. The morning after her arrival, the Duke had arranged for her to meet with his property steward, Mr. Eldridge, a man of considerable years whose demeanor suggested he had managed the Ravensfield estates through decades of careful, methodical attention. Together they had spent the entirety of the first day moving between the library and the adjacent study, reviewing ledgers that documented the financial entanglements of Catherine's position. The work was exacting and required her complete concentration. Catherine found that focusing on numbers and property assessments afforded her a welcome reprieve from examining too closely the peculiar tension that inhabited the manor whenever the Duke entered a room. The transaction between them had been established, the terms articulated with sufficient clarity that neither party could claim misunderstanding. Catherine would manage his rural holdings, optimize their productivity, and ensure their proper administration. In return, her compensation would be applied to the settlement of her family's outstanding obligation. It was rational. It was businesslike. It was, Catherine had determined, the only arrangement that would permit her to maintain her dignity. By the third day, Catherine had relocated boxes of archived correspondence to the library, spreading documents across the large oak table that dominated one end of the room. The accumulated papers represented years of property transactions, lease agreements, and administrative correspondence spanning at least 2 decades. Much of it was mundane, concerns about tenant repairs, discussions of crop yields, correspondence regarding the sale of parcels of land. Catherine organized these materials into categories, creating order from the accumulated neglect of years. It was during this process of cataloging that she discovered a bundle of letters secured with faded ribbon, tucked behind a ledger that appeared to have been filed away with particular care. The envelope was addressed in handwriting Catherine recognized immediately, despite the passage of a decade. Her father's script remained distinctive, the careful precision of a man who had attended Oxford and never ceased to demonstrate the fact through the deliberate formation of each letter. Catherine's hands stilled above the documents. For a moment, she simply stared at the envelope without touching it, as though the action of reading its contents might somehow alter the facts she had carried with her for the past decade. She knew with certainty what those letters contained. She had guessed their existence long ago, had suspected their contents, had built her understanding of events around the likelihood of their presence in precisely some archive such as this. "You have discovered something of interest." Catherine's head raised sharply at the sound of the Duke's voice. He stood in the doorway of the library, silhouetted against the pale afternoon light that filtered through the corridor beyond. How long he had been standing there she could not determine. His expression remained characteristically unreadable, though his eyes tracked toward the bundle of letters with apparent recognition. "I was organizing the correspondence," Catherine said, her voice maintaining the professional tone she had cultivated throughout her first days. "These appear to have been filed separately from the remainder of the materials. I assumed they might warrant attention during our review." He crossed the library without responding, his footsteps muffled against the wool carpet that stretched across the floor. He regarded the bundle without reaching for it, his jaw tightening in a manner that suggested recognition extending beyond mere curiosity. "Your father's handwriting," he observed quietly. "Yes," Catherine confirmed. She did not elaborate. Elaboration would have required her to address the reality of what those letters likely contained, and she was not prepared to venture into that territory. Instead, she returned her attention to the ledger before her, though her concentration had fractured entirely. "I have not opened them. I thought it preferable to bring them to your attention rather than assume their significance." "Your assumption was sound," he said after a prolonged silence. He reached for the bundle, his fingers brushing the ribbon, but did not remove it from the table. These are personal correspondence. They will require separate filing. Of course, Catherine agreed. She reorganized the papers around the bundle, creating space as though it had always been meant to occupy a position of prominence rather than concealment. The Duke remained standing beside the table, observing her movements without comment. His proximity created a subtle awareness that Catherine found distracting. The faint scent of sandalwood and leather, the barely perceptible sound of his breathing, the precise angle of his silhouette against the window light. "Your work has been thorough," he said eventually. "I had not anticipated that a single individual would accomplish this much organization in so short a time frame." "The task is reasonably straightforward when one approaches it methodically," Catherine replied. She arranged another stack of papers, maintaining her focus on the mechanical aspects of her employment. "I have identified several matters requiring your immediate attention. There are outstanding questions regarding tenant agreements on the northern property, and I have discovered discrepancies in the accounting that suggest either clerical errors or undocumented transactions. Such discrepancies are not uncommon in estates that have not received adequate oversight." He moved toward the window, placing distance between them. "I have had other concerns occupying my attention for considerable time." The statement hung between them, and Catherine recognized that he had offered her information that extended beyond the practical details of property management. She understood, without requiring explicit confirmation, that his other concerns had encompassed the decade during which she had been absent from England, caring for a father whose health had declined gradually into irreversible illness. "I am prepared to commence a comprehensive audit at your discretion," Catherine offered, redirecting the conversation toward the professional parameters she had established for their interaction. "The goal would be identifying any significant errors or inefficiencies that might be rectified before the growing season progresses further." "Proceed as you determine necessary," he said. "Mr. Eldridge will provide you with whatever access and documentation you require. The steward is capable, but he is aging, and matters have been allowed to accrue beyond his current capacity to manage them effectively." Catherine inclined her head in acknowledgement. She opened her mouth to address another item on the list of matters requiring clarification when the Duke spoke again, his voice carrying a different quality, something approaching hesitation. "Your father," he said, "managed his affairs without my knowledge or participation for an extended period. I trust that you harbor no expectation that matters of a personal nature will be addressed during your time at Ravensfield." "I harbor no such expectation," Catherine responded, meeting his gaze directly. Her voice remained steady, though responding to the implicit question required, drawing upon reserves of composure she had not realized she possessed. "I have come as your employee, Your Grace. My presence is predicated entirely upon my capacity to perform the duties we have outlined. Nothing beyond that scope requires attention or explanation." He studied her for a long moment, and Catherine observed the subtle relaxation of his expression. Not quite approval, but perhaps acknowledgement that she had understood the boundaries he had established. That understanding was correct. She had not returned to Ravensfield to revisit the past or to demand explanations for actions taken a decade prior. She had returned because she required employment and security. The personal dimensions of their history would remain precisely where they had been relegated, into the compartments of memory that both were capable of sealing away. Over the subsequent days, their interaction established itself into a pattern of professional cordiality. Catherine worked in the library and the study, organizing documents and establishing systems of order across the administrative structure of the Ravensfield properties. The Duke maintained his distance, appearing primarily to address matters of significant importance, or to review progress on projects Catherine had identified as requiring immediate attention. They exchanged necessary information with the formality of individuals bound by contract rather than history. Yet small moments accumulated despite their mutual determination to maintain professional distance. One afternoon, as Catherine reviewed tenant records and made notes regarding property conditions, the Duke entered with tea, an unnecessary gesture, one that suggested he had requested the kitchen staff prepare it specifically for her. She had looked up from her work, startled by the courtesy, and he had offered a minimal explanation. "You have been working without respite. The household staff noted that you had taken no refreshment." "Thank you," Catherine said, accepting the cup carefully. Their fingers had not quite touched, though she had been acutely aware of how near they had come to doing so. You need not concern yourself with such details. I am providing you with adequate conditions for performing your duties, he responded with characteristic formality. That is merely sound management. Yet when she mentioned in passing that she had discovered a manuscript of botanical observations written by a previous duchess, he had brought her the original text from the private collection in his chambers without her requesting it. When she had worked late into an evening reviewing property maps, he had appeared with brandy, claiming that he was also reviewing materials and had thought to offer her a glass. Small gestures that Catherine recognized as perhaps exceeding the bounds of purely professional relationship, yet she had accepted them with gratitude and without commentary. By the end of the first week, the fundamental terms of Catherine's employment had been formalized. A solicitor had been engaged to prepare the appropriate documentation. Her compensation would be issued quarterly, with precise calculations regarding how much of each payment would be applied toward the settlement of the outstanding obligation. She would reside at Ravensfield Manor, occupying chambers on the second floor that had once belonged to a distant aunt. She would manage the rural properties with complete authority regarding operational decisions within specified financial parameters. She would attend to administrative responsibilities as directed, reporting quarterly regarding the state of the holdings under her supervision. Everything had been reduced to terms and conditions, to obligations and compensations. Everything had been carefully organized into a structure that denied the possibility of ambiguity or misunderstanding. And yet, on her first evening formally employed, when Catherine had returned to her chambers and discovered a collection of books regarding agricultural innovation placed upon her writing desk, she had understood that some aspects of their interaction were perhaps destined to exceed the parameters of their formal agreement. The Duke had written no note. He had claimed no credit. But Catherine had recognized the gesture for what it was. An acknowledgement, unspoken but unmistakable, that he recognized her capacity and valued her contributions beyond the mere mechanics of financial obligation. She had placed the books carefully on the shelf beside her bed and had allowed herself, for precisely one moment, to acknowledge the thin fracture that had begun to form in the wall of professional distance they had both worked so diligently to construct. The carriage wheels struck the rutted country roads with rhythmic precision, carrying Catherine and the Duke northward toward the modest estate that had comprised her entire world for the past decade. The journey from Ravensfield to the Ashworth property in Yorkshire required 4 days of travel, a distance measured not merely in miles but in the accumulated silence between two individuals who had learned to navigate proximity without genuine connection. Catherine had prepared herself for the discomfort of extended confinement, for the inevitable awkwardness of shared carriage space across nights that would require lodging arrangements and days of inescapable proximity. What she had not adequately prepared herself for was the gradual dissolution of the barriers she had so carefully constructed. On the first day of travel, the Duke had occupied himself with correspondence, reviewing documents that required his attention while Catherine gazed out at the passing landscape. The weather remained temperate, the English spring offering gentle promises of warmer months to come. They exchanged minimal commentary beyond observations regarding travel conditions and adjustments to their route necessitated by road conditions. That night, they lodged at an inn outside Manchester, a respectable establishment where Catherine was shown to a private chamber, and the Duke maintained appropriate distance. The transformation began on the second day, almost imperceptibly. As the carriage traversed rolling farmland, Catherine had mentioned, without intention of expanding upon the observation, that her father had always admired Yorkshire landscapes. The Duke had asked with apparent genuine curiosity what specifically had captured the Viscount's admiration. Catherine found herself responding with detail, describing her father's particular affection for moorland vistas and the agricultural methods employed in northern regions. The Duke had listened with an attentiveness that suggested he was genuinely absorbing her words, rather than merely tolerating them. When he responded, his observations demonstrated that he had retained information Catherine had provided during their first weeks at Ravensfield, small details regarding her educational background, her years abroad, her father's interests. He asked questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite obligation. By the third day, conversations had acquired a different character entirely. They discussed matters extending considerably beyond the scope of professional relationship. Catherine, responding to a direct question regarding her time in Europe, found herself describing the decade with unexpected honesty. She spoke of caring for her father as his health deteriorated, of the progressive restriction of her life as his requirements consumed more of her energy and resources. She described the gradual narrowing of possibilities, the marriages she had declined because her father required her presence, the social connections she had abandoned because maintaining them was incompatible with her primary responsibilities. She spoke not with bitterness but with the acceptance of someone who had reconciled herself to sacrifice years prior. The Duke listened without interruption. When she concluded her narrative, he did not offer sympathy or platitudes. Instead, he offered confession of his own. He described Eleanor's death with sparse detail, illness that arrived suddenly, complications that could not be adequately addressed. He mentioned, with evident reluctance, the manner in which society had interpreted her death, the whispers and insinuations that had suggested his culpability. He described the years of investigation, the desperate search for evidence that might vindicate him, the gradual realization that truth mattered far less than appearance. I spent years believing that if I could prove my innocence, the world would acknowledge it, he said quietly as the carriage moved through moorland that grew progressively wilder. I discovered that proof is irrelevant when condemnation has already been rendered. Catherine responded carefully. There is a distinction between guilt and innocence, she said. Guilt resides in action and intention. Innocence is merely the absence of those elements. Society's judgment cannot alter what actually occurred. Society's judgment alters everything, he replied. It alters reputation, position, the capacity to function within the structure of one's world. True, Catherine acknowledged, but it cannot alter truth, however much it obscures or misconstrues it. He had turned to look at her then, truly looked at her, with an intensity that suggested he was seeing her for perhaps the first time since she had arrived at Ravensfield. His expression carried gratitude mixed with something else. Recognition, perhaps, that she was offering him understanding without judgment, acknowledgement without absolution. The fourth day brought them to the boundary of the Ashworth holdings. The landscape had become progressively more rural, moorland giving way to cultivated fields that had known better maintenance in previous years. As the carriage approached the residence itself, Catherine felt the familiar weight of return settle upon her. The house emerged from behind a rise in the terrain, a stone structure of considerable age, built during the reign of a monarch whose name had become historical trivia. Gardens surrounded it in patterns that had been deliberate decades prior, but had since surrendered to nature's indifference. The Duke regarded the property with evident appraisal. The estate was respectable without being remarkable, comfortable without manifesting luxury. The grounds displayed clear evidence of minimal oversight. The gardens had returned largely to wilderness. The hedgerows had grown without pruning. The gravel drive bore the accumulated detritus of seasons without maintenance. "How long have you been absent?" he asked quietly as the carriage slowed to a halt before the entrance. 10 years, Catherine replied, "since my father's health began its decline. We traveled to a warmer climate, hoping that might slow the progression of his illness. It did not." The Duke descended from the carriage first, extending his hand to assist Catherine down. His palm was warm, his grip steady. The contact persisted longer than practical necessity required, a deliberate gesture rather than perfunctory courtesy. Catherine felt the warmth of that contact travel through her hand, up her arm, settling in her chest with the force of something consequential. She met his gaze briefly, acknowledging the moment without commentary, and neither acknowledged the significance of what had just transpired. They walked the grounds together as afternoon light began its descent toward evening. Catherine showed him the gardens where she had spent countless hours during her youth, before isolation and responsibility had narrowed her world. She pointed toward the moorland where her father had ridden before his condition made such exertion impossible. She described the property with the precision of someone who knew every stone and shrub intimately, yet spoke of it with the distance of someone returning to a place that no longer entirely belonged to her. The Duke observed the condition of the structures, the state of repairs that had been deferred, the gardens that had surrendered to entropy. He did not offer empty reassurances. Instead, he simply acknowledged the reality. You surrendered this place to care for your father. It was not a question, and Catherine did not pretend it was. I surrendered many things, she said quietly. The property was merely the most tangible. That evening, in the drawing room of her childhood home, Catherine felt something shift between them. The careful professional distance that had characterized their relationship at Ravensfield had eroded through days of enforced proximity and unexpected honesty. Yet neither addressed the change directly. Instead, they existed in this new configuration, closer, more aware of each other, yet maintaining the pretense that nothing fundamental had altered in their arrangement. When the Duke retired to the guest chambers that night, Catherine remained in the library where she had spent so many hours during her decade of isolation. She held her hand before her, remembering the sensation of his touch, the deliberate pressure of his fingers, the moment in which their carefully constructed distance had fractured into something less defined and infinitely more dangerous. The return journey to Ravensfield Manor seemed compressed into fewer days than the outbound voyage had required, as though the carriage itself conspired to diminish the distance between Yorkshire and the Duke's principal seat. Catherine observed the transformation of landscape through the window, moorland surrendering to cultivated fields, wild spaces giving way to ordered estates that bore the unmistakable marks of considerable wealth and established lineage. She maintained her attention on the passing scenery rather than on the man seated across from her. Though she remained acutely aware of his presence in the manor, one cannot help but notice the absence of light. The conversation that had blossomed during their journey northward had contracted into careful silence during the return. Neither had explicitly acknowledged the shift in their relationship, yet both comprehended that something fundamental had altered. The professional distance Catherine had constructed so deliberately at Ravensfield had become impossible to resurrect. The Duke carried himself differently now, his bearing suggesting a man who had ventured into unfamiliar emotional territory and was uncertain how to navigate the return. Upon their arrival at the manor, Catherine had been shown to her chambers by the household staff with the usual courtesy. She had unpacked her traveling trunks, reviewed correspondence that had accumulated during her absence, and attempted to resume her responsibilities with the professionalism that her position demanded. The Duke, meanwhile, had retreated to his private study to address matters requiring attention during his absence. It was 3 days after their return when everything fractured. Catherine was cataloging additional property records in the library when the Duke entered with an expression that suggested he had been conducting an inventory of his emotions and found them significantly misaligned with his expectations. He held a bundle of papers, the same letters her father had written a decade prior, the ones Catherine had discovered during her first week at Ravensfield, the ones she had carefully organized and filed but had not opened, respecting the privacy of correspondence never intended for her examination. "These are letters from your father," he stated without preamble. His voice carried a quality Catherine had not heard before, something approximating controlled fury beneath layers of carefully maintained composure. "Written to me during the period immediately following Eleanor's death, offering assistance, offering financial support, offering himself as a vocal advocate for my vindication." Catherine set down the document she had been examining. She did not rise, did not perform the gestures of deference that typically accompanied direct address from the Duke. Instead, she waited, understanding that he had not finished and that interruption would be counterproductive. "These letters were never delivered to me," he continued, moving toward the window where afternoon light created sharp shadows across his features. "I have reviewed them multiple times now, attempting to understand the circumstances by which correspondence addressed to me arrived instead in your father's personal archive. My father kept them," Catherine said quietly. "He decided that you required solitude more than you required interference, however well-intentioned that interference might be. Your father decided." The Duke turned to face her directly. "Your father orchestrated events according to his own assessment of what I required. And you, Miss Ashworth, you have been in possession of this knowledge since your arrival at Ravensfield, have you not?" Catherine considered denying it, recognized the futility of such denial, and chose instead to acknowledge the accuracy of his accusation. "Yes. During my initial review of household archives, I discovered these letters. I did not open them. I did not believe it was my prerogative to examine your personal correspondence, even correspondence that remained undelivered. Yet you organized them, he said. You filed them among the documents you were cataloging. You thereby ensured they would eventually surface for my attention, which they have. The question I find myself unable to adequately answer is whether that action represented honesty or manipulation. The word struck Catherine with the force of physical contact. Manipulation. He was suggesting that her careful silence had been a form of deception, that her refusal to intrude upon his privacy had been calculated strategy rather than respect. I protected you, Catherine said, and the words carried the weight of a decade of careful choices, of deliberate isolation, of decisions made in service to someone else's well-being. My father's letters were his private confession of his intentions toward you. That information was not mine to share, not mine to weaponize, not mine to offer as explanation or excuse. You asked me upon my arrival whether I harbored expectations that personal matters would be addressed. I honored that request by maintaining silence regarding matters that were not my concern. By deceiving me regarding your knowledge of those matters, he replied. By existing in this household knowing information that directly addressed my understanding of events that shaped the preceding decade of my life, and maintaining that silence as though it were an act of honor rather than betrayal. Catherine rose to her feet then, drawing upon reserves of dignity she had not known she still possessed. If my father's attempt to assist you during a crisis was something you wished to have known about, then yes, my silence regarding those letters constitutes betrayal by your definition. But I cannot accept responsibility for my father's decision to write correspondence you never received. I cannot accept blame for respecting the privacy of his personal papers, and I will not accept the characterization of protection as manipulation. They stood in the library surrounded by documents and books and accumulated knowledge, separated by more than mere physical distance. Outside, rain had begun to fall against the windows, and Catherine was acutely aware that something essential had shifted between them. The fragile connection that had begun to form during their journey northward had shattered against the rocks of revelation and misunderstanding. I believe it would be most appropriate if I concluded my employment at Ravensfield, Catherine said quietly. The words emerged as though someone else was speaking through her, though she recognized they were necessary. The arrangement we established was predicated upon mutual trust and professional conduct. I have failed to maintain the transparency you required, however unintentionally. My continued residence here would only complicate matters further. The Duke did not respond immediately. He stood motionless, the letters still in his hand, his expression arranged into something Catherine could not adequately interpret. When he finally spoke, his voice had returned to its characteristic formality, all traces of anger buried beneath layers of controlled civility. You will remain in your current position until the end of the month, he said. I will not have it said that we terminated your employment under circumstances that might invite speculation or damage your reputation further. We will conduct ourselves with appropriate professionalism during that interval. Your compensation will be calculated through the termination date, and any outstanding matters regarding your family's financial obligation will be adjusted accordingly. Catherine inclined her head in acknowledgement, understanding that he was offering her an exit that preserved her dignity. However much both of them recognized that dignity had become a fragile thing. She turned toward the documents she had been organizing, and the Duke departed without further comment, leaving her alone with her papers and the sound of rain against the windows, and the knowledge that she had come to Ravensfield seeking financial security, and had instead discovered precisely how much one could lose by allowing another person to matter. The month that followed unfolded with the inevitability of a tragedy already written. Neither spoke of the confrontation directly. Neither attempted to bridge the gulf that had opened between them. They inhabited the same residence as cordial strangers, conducting their business through careful exchanges of information and measured interactions that preserved the appearance of professional relationship while confirming the reality of profound disconnection. Catherine moved through her final weeks at Ravensfield with the mechanical precision of someone performing a series of tasks she had already completed in her mind. And the Duke maintained his distance with the resolve of a man who had learned precisely how thoroughly hope could deceive one. The townhouse in Belgravia that Evelyn Vance had offered to Catherine for the duration of her London residence possessed the kind of refined elegance that came from generations of careful stewardship. High ceilings caught light that filtered through tall windows, and the furnishings suggested comfort rather than ostentation. Yet the rooms felt suffocatingly small to Catherine during those first weeks following her departure from Ravensfield. She moved through corridors that seemed to narrow with each passing day, her mind returning perpetually to the library where she had spent her final month, constructing the architectural foundations of professional distance. Eleanor had been circling her for days before she finally spoke directly. It was late afternoon, the kind of English spring day that promised better weather without quite delivering it, when Eleanor entered Catherine's chamber without the courtesy of announcement and settled herself in the chair opposite the window where Catherine had been gazing out at the London street below. "You will destroy yourself through inaction," Eleanor said without preamble. She was a woman of considerable directness, a quality Catherine had always appreciated, though she found it considerably less welcome when directed toward her current circumstances. "You sit in this house like a prisoner awaiting execution, reviewing property documents, managing accounts, performing every function except the one that actually matters to you." "I am managing my affairs with appropriate diligence," Catherine replied. She did not turn from the window. "My situation requires orderly attention to financial matters. The documents I have been reviewing are necessary if I am to establish independent circumstances. Your situation requires you to acknowledge that you love the Duke," Eleanor said flatly, "that you have spent 10 years loving him, that you returned to Ravensfield loving him, and that you left Ravensfield loving him, that you will remain in London loving him unless something fundamental changes." Catherine's jaw tightened. Loving someone does not constitute sufficient foundation for maintaining a relationship when trust has been compromised. I maintained silence regarding matters he believed he had explicitly requested I address. That silence, regardless of my intentions, constituted betrayal. "Did he not ask you to maintain appropriate distance regarding personal matters?" Eleanor's tone suggested she already knew the answer and was simply verifying it. "Did he not establish those parameters upon your arrival? You honored those parameters. That is fidelity, not betrayal, and if he cannot distinguish between the two, then he is considerably less intelligent than I have credited him with being." Catherine turned to face her friend directly. "Eleanor, I appreciate your defense of my actions, but the situation has progressed beyond the question of whether I acted appropriately. The question is whether our relationship can survive the damage that has occurred. That question can only be answered if you remain in proximity to answer it." Eleanor replied, "Running to London does not resolve matters. It simply extends the period during which both you and he suffer unnecessarily." Catherine did not respond to that observation. Instead, she returned her attention to the street below, where the ordinary rhythms of London life continued indifferent to her emotional circumstances. Yet Eleanor's words had planted themselves in her consciousness like seeds that could not be uprooted, and she found herself returning to them during the isolated hours of the following days. Meanwhile, at Ravensfield Manor, James Whitmore discovered that the estate he had inhabited for years had somehow transformed into a place that no longer accommodated his presence. The library, which had been his refuge since childhood, now felt hollow in ways he had not anticipated. The chair where Catherine had sat reviewing documents seemed to mock him with its emptiness. The table where she had organized his family's history had become a monument to loss. He attempted to conduct his business as he had done for the preceding decade, withdrawing into work, into the management of his considerable holdings, into the careful construction of distance between himself and any possibility of genuine human connection. That routine collapsed utterly 3 weeks after Catherine's departure, when a solicitor arrived at Ravensfield bearing documentation that suggested his authority over his own affairs was open to question. Marcus Whitmore, the Duke's cousin, had filed a formal contest regarding several recent financial decisions, alleging that the Duke's mental faculties had become compromised. The specific transactions in question were those that had provided Catherine with her compensation and those that had formalized her authority over the rural properties. By week's end, a banker who had never before requested guarantees asked for 2. A tenant on the northern boundary delayed his rent, pending clarification. It was not ruin, only the slow ache of doubt finding purchase. The allegations were precise and damaging. Marcus was not suggesting that the Duke was entirely incapable. He was suggesting far more subtly, and therefore far more effectively, that Catherine Ashworth had exerted undue influence over her employer, that she had manipulated the Duke through her proximity and her apparent neediness, that her departure from the household represented either abandonment, once she had extracted sufficient compensation, or a deliberately orchestrated separation designed to enhance her victim's sense of isolation and thereby increase her control when she eventually returned. The Duke's solicitor assured him that the contest was unlikely to succeed. The transactions in question were entirely within his authority. There was abundant documentation regarding Catherine's competence and the legitimacy of her compensation, yet the existence of the challenge itself was sufficient to create uncertainty, and uncertainty was precisely what Marcus required to establish himself as a figure of legitimate concern within the family. It was during this period of escalating legal complexity that Lady Cecilia Whitmore made a decision that would alter the trajectory of events irreversibly. She had observed the developments with characteristic calculation, assessing how best to deploy her considerable resources to protect the inheritance she had orchestrated for her son. Marcus's legal challenge was adequate to create disruption, but it would ultimately fail. What was required was something more substantive, more damaging, something that would ensure the Duke could not afford the complications that Catherine represented. Cecilia had possessed certain documents for years. Correspondence that Eleanor had written to someone who was decidedly not the Duke. Correspondence that detailed affection and intimacy extending far beyond what a spouse should acknowledge to another individual. The letters had arrived in Cecilia's possession through channels she preferred not to examine too closely, and she had maintained them as insurance against various contingencies. The nature of Eleanor's infidelity was a fact that might, under appropriate circumstances, alter significantly the manner in which the Duke's marriage had been perceived. More importantly, it raised questions regarding Eleanor's death. If the Duke had discovered her infidelity, if he had realized that she had betrayed him in the most profound manner that a wife could betray a husband, might not someone with motive have existed for hastening Eleanor's demise? Cecilia did not believe the Duke had poisoned his wife, but she believed quite firmly that the suggestion of that possibility, if introduced at the appropriate moment with the appropriate emphasis, could prove extraordinarily useful. She arranged for copies of Eleanor's letters to be placed in the hands of individuals who could be relied upon to discuss them broadly. Simultaneously, she requested a private audience with the Duke, during which she presented him with originals of the correspondence and explained, with elaborate expressions of regret, what their existence might mean for his reputation should they become public knowledge. She suggested, with the delicate precision of someone who had perfected the art of manipulation, that his continued pursuit of Catherine Ashworth was inadvisable, that such pursuit would inevitably lead to renewed scrutiny of Eleanor's death, renewed examination of the circumstances surrounding her passing, and ultimately to revelations that could destroy him entirely. The Duke, confronted simultaneously with Marcus's legal challenge and Cecilia's calculated threats, found himself in precisely the position she had designed for him. Yet before he could adequately process the implications of Cecilia's ultimatum, he received a visitor who offered a different perspective entirely. Timothy Vance arrived at Ravensfield bearing documentation regarding the legal challenges Marcus had initiated, but his appearance had secondary implications. He was Eleanor's brother, which meant he was also an individual with access to certain facts regarding Eleanor's personal life that the Duke had not previously comprehended. More importantly, he came bearing a message from Catherine. Not a letter, not a formal communication, but a clear indication that she had not forgotten him, that she was aware of his circumstances, and that she remained positioned to assist him if he would permit her to do so. Miss Ashworth does not wish to involve herself directly in your legal difficulties, Tim explained as they sat in the Duke's study. However, she is aware that contests to your authority have been filed. She is also aware that certain individuals possess information that might be used to complicate your circumstances further. She wished me to communicate that should you require counsel or assistance, she remains available. The Duke regarded the solicitor with carefully modulated attention. Miss Ashworth departed Ravensfield because she determined that her continued presence endangered my stability and my reputation. I fail to see how her involvement in legal proceedings would accomplish anything other than confirming whatever insinuations have been introduced regarding her influence over my decisions. That assessment would be correct, Tim replied, provided that her involvement were visible. However, there are methods by which one might offer counsel and support without appearing to do so. The question is not whether Miss Ashworth can assist. The question is whether you will permit her to. The Duke did not answer immediately. Instead, he found himself contemplating the precise nature of the choice before him. Catherine had maintained silence regarding her knowledge of his circumstances. She had not demanded his attention or attempted to insert herself into his difficulties. Yet her offer of assistance, communicated through an intermediary, suggested that the distance she had created was perhaps not as absolute as he had believed. For the first time since she had departed Ravensfield, the Duke allowed himself to consider the possibility that some aspects of their connection might have survived the fracture between them. The ballroom of Lady Ashford's residence glittered beneath chandeliers that cast their crystalline light across assembled members of London society gathered for the evening's entertainment. The orchestra occupied its platform at one end of the vast room, instruments polished to such brightness that they reflected the illumination back into the crowd like captured stars. Catherine had arrived with Eleanor precisely at the hour when attendants demonstrated appropriate attention to social obligation without suggesting excessive eagerness. She wore a gown of pale silver silk, a deliberate choice that suggested mourning restraint rather than celebratory enthusiasm, and carried herself with the practiced composure of someone who had learned to navigate scrutiny without acknowledging its presence. The evening had proceeded with unremarkable civility for the first several hours. Catherine had accepted invitations to dance, exchanged appropriate pleasantries with acquaintances, and maintained the careful distance from the center of attention that her circumstances demanded. She was conscious of being observed. The woman who had disappeared from society a decade prior had returned, and her reappearance warranted assessment. Yet the observation remained relatively benign until Marcus Whitmore arrived, moving through the assembled guests with the assured bearing of someone confident in his welcome. He had positioned himself strategically near the refreshment table, where Catherine stood conversing with an elderly countess of indifferent reputation. His voice, when he began speaking, carried clearly enough that those positioned within proximity could distinguish his words, though he maintained the pretense of addressing only those immediately adjacent to him. "Remarkable how circumstances alter," Marcus observed to a gentleman at his elbow. "One hears that certain individuals return to England with surprising expectations regarding their social position. Financial difficulties abroad can create most peculiar assumptions regarding what society might overlook." Catherine felt the conversation around her contract subtly, as though those within auditory range had simultaneously decided to attend more carefully to the words being spoken. The elderly countess at her side shifted her weight uncomfortably, clearly sensing the direction of Marcus's commentary and uncertain whether she wished to remain adjacent to the object of his insinuations. "It appears some families have difficulty managing resources," Marcus continued, his tone remaining deceptively light. "One must wonder what calculations inform the decision to return to England specifically and to present oneself to particular households. The tongue has always been susceptible to individuals possessed of certain talents." The implication was sufficiently clear that Catherine felt the careful construction of her social acceptance begin to fracture. Around her, faces shifted from polite interest to something approaching sympathy, mixed with the peculiar satisfaction that accompanied witnessing another individual's social diminishment. She understood the mechanics of what was occurring. Marcus was suggesting that her return to England, her employment at Ravensfield, her entire presence in society was calculated manipulation, designed to secure financial advantage through the exploitation of an emotionally vulnerable man. She recognized also that once such insinuations were introduced into the social atmosphere, they would circulate with the inevitability of poison dispersing through water. The accuracy of the accusations mattered far less than the drama of their utterance. By morning, society would have transformed her from an interesting curiosity into a predatory schemer. Catherine set down her untouched refreshment and moved toward the periphery of the ballroom, positioning herself near one of the tall windows that framed the London street beyond. She maintained her expression with the discipline of years, though internally she was experiencing the peculiar sensation of watching her carefully constructed life collapse with remarkable efficiency. She had been naive, she recognized, to imagine that her professional relationship with the Duke could be maintained with sufficient distance to avoid precisely this sort of social assault. She did not hear his arrival, though she became aware of it through the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The orchestra's selection seemed to hesitate, or perhaps that was merely her imagination. The conversations did not cease entirely, yet they acquired a different quality, one less focused on their own content and more oriented toward the central drama that was beginning to unfold. The Duke of Ravensfield crossed the ballroom with the purposefulness of a man whose attention had been drawn to something requiring his immediate consideration. His expression remained largely unreadable, though Catherine detected the subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested he had overheard at least some portion of Marcus's comments. He moved directly toward Catherine, his progress through the assembled guests, marked by a parting of the crowd that suggested his presence carried considerable authority. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice cutting through the ambient conversation with remarkable clarity, "I find myself in need of your counsel regarding certain matters that require your particular expertise. Would you honor me with your time?" It was not a question structured as inquiry. It was a statement of intention that allowed Catherine only the option of acceptance or public refusal. She met his gaze for the first time since he had crossed the ballroom, and observed in his expression something that suggested his appearance was not coincidental, that he had somehow learned of the evening's proceedings and had determined to attend despite whatever obligations might have competed for his attention. "Of course, Your Grace," Catherine replied, permitting him to extend his hand in assistance with rising from her position near the window. The moment her fingers made contact with his palm, she felt the subtle increase in pressure, a gesture so slight that only she would perceive it, yet unmistakable in its meaning. The orchestra struck up a waltz at that precise moment, and the Duke guided Catherine directly toward the dance floor, with the conviction of someone who had anticipated precisely this musical selection. Around them, Catherine was conscious of the sensation of collective shock rippling through the assembled company. The Duke did not dance. The Duke had not danced with anyone since Eleanor's death. The Duke certainly did not dance with women of uncertain social standing while his own cousin was circulating insinuations regarding their relationship. Yet there he was, moving with practiced elegance through the prescribed patterns of the waltz, holding Catherine with sufficient proximity that their conversation would be audible only to each other, and positioning himself with deliberate visibility to ensure that every member of the assembled society observed precisely what his attention had determined to be important. "I have been made aware," he said quietly as they moved through a turn, "of commentary regarding your character and your circumstances. I wish to communicate to everyone present, through the mechanism of this dance and my obvious continued regard, that the assessment of society regarding your worth is of considerably less consequence to me than my own assessment." Catherine felt something within her chest contract with the force of genuine emotion. "Your Grace, you should not. The implications are precisely what I intend," he interrupted. "I am communicating through action that my priorities have fundamentally altered, that your reputation, your standing, your continued presence in my life matters more to me than heraldic considerations or familial expectation." They completed the waltz in silence, moving through its prescribed patterns while the entire ballroom observed the spectacle of the Duke's apparent defection from years of careful distance. When the music concluded, he returned her to the edge of the ballroom with the courtesy of a man who has completed a necessary task. Yet he positioned himself sufficiently near that anyone observing would understand his vigilance regarding her well-being had not concluded. 3 days later, when the Duke arrived at the townhouse in Belgravia after darkness had claimed the London streets, Eleanor recognized the significance of his unannounced visit and disappeared into the private quarters with the discretion of someone who understands when her presence would constitute intrusion. They stood in the drawing room as servants prepared tea that neither would drink, and the Duke regarded Catherine with an intensity that suggested he had spent the intervening days constructing the framework for this conversation with considerable deliberation. "I have spent 10 years attempting to distance myself from the possibility of genuine connection," he said without preamble. "I constructed a life predicated upon isolation and carefully maintained separation from anyone who might threaten the architecture of emotional protection I had constructed. And then you returned to Ravensfield, and every barrier I had so meticulously established began fragmenting. Catherine did not interrupt. She recognized that he required space to articulate what had been accumulating within him for weeks. I was angry at you, he continued, because your silence regarding your knowledge of your father's letters felt like betrayal. But I have come to understand that anger was displaced. I was angry at myself for the decade during which I rejected assistance because I feared that accepting help constituted weakness. I was angry at circumstances I could not control, and I directed that anger at you, because you represented the possibility of vulnerability in a manner I was not prepared to acknowledge. And now? Catherine asked quietly. Now I acknowledge that a decade without you has felt like a form of prolonged dying, he said. That the brief weeks of your presence at Ravensfield contained more genuine living than years of careful isolation. That the possibility of losing you again is infinitely more terrifying than the certainty of maintaining my carefully constructed distance. He moved toward her, closing the physical space between them with deliberation that suggested he was asking permission through action rather than words. When he reached her, he did not touch her, though she felt the warmth of his proximity like a tangible force. I am asking if you might consider permitting me the opportunity to build something genuine with you, he said. Not employment, not transaction, not arrangement. Something that acknowledges what has existed between us despite our attempts to deny it. The drawing room of the Duke's London residence possessed the kind of understated elegance that suggested wealth without requiring demonstration of it. Heavy curtains in deep blue damask framed the windows, and furniture arranged in comfortable configurations, rather than formal presentation, suggested spaces designed for actual occupation rather than mere display. Catherine sat in one such arrangement when the Duke entered, his expression carrying the weight of decisions recently made and conversations recently concluded. He did not waste time with preliminary pleasantries. Instead, he moved directly to the matter that had drawn him to London with such evident urgency. I have received communication from a solicitor retained by Lady Cecilia Whitmore, he said, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone delivering information that was simultaneously expected and unwelcome. She has requested a private meeting regarding matters she believes require my immediate attention. I have accepted the invitation, primarily because I have determined that avoidance of whatever she is prepared to demonstrate would constitute precisely the weakness she is calculating I will exhibit. Catherine's hands, which had been folded in her lap, tightened slightly. She comprehended that whatever Cecilia had orchestrated, it had reached sufficient intensity to require the Duke's direct engagement. The meeting took place this afternoon, he continued, settling himself into the chair opposite hers. She presented me with correspondence written by Eleanor to someone who was decidedly not her husband. Letters that detailed affection extending considerably beyond what a spouse should acknowledge to another individual. Letters that would, if introduced into society, alter fundamentally the manner in which my marriage has been perceived. Catherine's breath caught, though she maintained her composure with the discipline that had sustained her through a decade of loss. She understood immediately the implications Cecilia was constructing. If Eleanor had betrayed the Duke through infidelity, then certain questions became suddenly consequential. Questions regarding motive, regarding whether the Duke possessed reason sufficient to hasten his wife's death, regarding whether his subsequent years of isolation and investigation represented genuine mourning or calculated deception. Cecilia presented these letters as insurance, the Duke said quietly. She informed me that should I continue to pursue my relationship with you, these documents would circulate through channels designed to ensure maximum damage to my reputation. She suggested that the Tun would inevitably conclude that Eleanor's death was neither natural nor accidental, that I had discovered her infidelity and had determined to eliminate what she perceived as humiliation through poison or other means. Do you believe she would actually release them? Catherine asked. I believe she would release them with enthusiasm and complete absence of regret, he replied. What she has constructed is elegantly simple. If I remain with you, she circulates the letters, and thereby casts me as a man capable of murdering his wife. If I abandon you, I signal that her threats have proven effective, and my credibility regarding my own character is fundamentally compromised. He paused, and Catherine observed the moment in which his expression shifted into something more determined. I have spent considerable time contemplating how to respond to this particular threat. I have considered the various mechanisms through which damage might be contained or minimized. I have calculated the social consequences and assessed the political ramifications, and I have concluded that I have been approaching this from fundamentally incorrect direction. Catherine waited. She recognized that he had reached some form of resolution, and interruption would serve neither of them. I do not actually care what society believes regarding Eleanor's death, he said. I do not care whether people conclude I was cuckold or murderer or victim of circumstance. What I care about is that you remain in my life. What I care about is that the possibility of building something genuine with you is not sacrificed to preserve Eleanor's posthumous reputation or to maintain my standing in society's judgment. He rose from his chair and moved toward her with the purposefulness of a man who had constructed his intention carefully. I am proposing marriage, Catherine. Not for protection, not for transaction, not because society demands it or because legal structures require it. I am proposing marriage because I cannot contemplate facing the remainder of my life without the possibility of your presence in it. Catherine felt something shift within her chest, yet she did not immediately respond to the proposal. Instead, she articulated the concern that had occupied her consciousness since she had learned of the Duke's need for financial security. Marriage would only confirm what Cecilia is already suggesting, Catherine said quietly. If we marry, she will circulate those letters, and society will interpret the marriage as evidence of your guilt. They will suggest that you have chosen to marry me as distraction from your own culpability, that you have abandoned Eleanor's memory not out of genuine growth but out of fear and calculation. Yes, the Duke agreed. That is precisely what will occur, and I have determined that her interpretation is irrelevant to my actions. He extended his hand to her, and Catherine rose to meet him in the space between their chairs. His fingers were warm, his grip steady with certainty. I will not marry you to rescue you from financial difficulty, he continued. I will not marry you to avoid social consequence or to protect either of our reputations. I will marry you only if you consent to do so from genuine choice rather than necessity. I will marry you privately, with only our closest companions as witnesses, because the ceremony belongs to us, rather than to society's judgment of it. Your Grace. My name is James, he interrupted. If we are to undertake this commitment, I believe you should address me by the designation that acknowledges our actual relationship rather than our social positions. Catherine considered his proposal carefully. She recognized that accepting it constituted genuine vulnerability on his part, that he was offering her not merely marriage but the willingness to stand against every pressure society could exert in defense of their relationship. I require one condition, she said quietly. Name it. The ceremony must occur only after we have lived openly as a committed couple for an appropriate interval. Catherine replied, I will not marry you as immediate response to Cecilia's threat. That would confirm her assessment that circumstances are driving our decisions. But if we remain committed to each other despite her efforts to separate us, despite the social consequences she has orchestrated, then a ceremony becomes affirmation of genuine choice rather than reaction to coercion. She felt him exhale, and his expression softened into something approximating relief. 3 months, he suggested, long enough to demonstrate that our commitment transcends temporary circumstance, long enough for society to begin adjusting to the reality of our partnership. 3 months, Catherine agreed. He did not kiss her, though the moment seemed to invite it. Instead, he simply held her hand, marking the commitment through gesture rather than physical demonstration. Outside the windows, London continued its indifferent progression through evening, wholly unaware that two individuals had just determined to defy every convention that society had constructed to maintain appropriate distance between individuals of their respective stations and circumstances. They did not hurry the promise. 3 full months were allowed to stand between resolution and ritual. Months lived stubbornly in the open, under the coiling gaze of London, until talk exhausted itself and only fact remained. On the morning appointed 3 months to the day after their decision, the chapel at Ravensfield Manor occupied a wing of the estate that had stood untouched for years, its stone walls weathered by time and neglect, its windows filtering pale morning light into patterns of extraordinary gentleness. Catherine arrived on the arm of Timothy Vance, Eleanor following behind in a gown of soft lavender silk that suggested celebration rather than mourning. The chapel contained no vast congregation, no assembled members of society prepared to bear witness to public commitment. Instead, it held only those individuals who had positioned themselves at the center of this story through deliberate choice rather than social obligation. Evelyn Vance stood near the altar with the bearing of a woman who had orchestrated far more complex arrangements than the present ceremony required. Timothy had assumed his position as witness and advocate, his legal expertise having proven instrumental in the preceding weeks. Sir Henry Goodwin occupied the space beside the Duke with the comfortable familiarity of a man who had known him for decades and had watched his progression from isolation into genuine connection. The chaplain, an elderly gentleman from the village whose discretion was absolute, waited with his liturgical materials arranged before him. The Duke turned when Catherine entered the chapel, and the expression that crossed his face suggested that no amount of anticipation could have adequately prepared him for the reality of witnessing her in this moment. She wore a gown of cream silk that Eleanor had selected with careful attention to elegance rather than ostentatious display. No elaborate headdress crowned her head. Instead, her blonde hair had been arranged with deliberate simplicity, swept back to reveal the features that James had come to recognize as containing far more beauty than society's superficial assessments could acknowledge. The ceremony itself proceeded with the formality that the occasion demanded, yet without the performance that larger public ceremonies would have required. Catherine and James exchanged vows that bore no trace of recitation or mere social compliance. Instead, they articulated commitments informed by a decade of separation, by weeks of honest conversation, by the accumulation of understanding that came from having genuinely known another person across the full spectrum of strength and vulnerability. When the chaplain pronounced them married, the moment held the weight of genuine transformation rather than administrative formality. James retained Catherine's hand as they turned to face their assembled witnesses, and the expression on his face suggested that he was acknowledging not merely the legal reality of marriage, but the profound permission it represented to exist openly with someone he had come to value above every other consideration. The celebration that followed was intimate in the truest sense of that designation. They returned to the manor, where a supper had been arranged in the dining room, candles creating an atmosphere of refined comfort rather than architectural grandeur. Conversations flowed with the ease of individuals who no longer required careful maintenance of professional distance. Sir Henry recounted anecdotes that suggested his long friendship with James had encompassed considerably more complexity than anyone observing their public relationship would have suspected. Eleanor offered observations regarding the resilience required to build genuine connections in opposition to social expectation. Timothy presented a gift of legal documentation that formally transferred certain properties to Catherine's personal control, rendering her financially independent should circumstances ever require it. When the evening reached its conclusion, James excused himself briefly, suggesting to Catherine that he required her presence in the library for a matter requiring her particular attention. She followed him through corridors she had come to navigate with ease, finding him standing before the fireplace with a document held between his hands. The paper bore the marks of age and deliberate preservation. James had written it 10 years prior, in the months following Eleanor's death, during the period when he had determined that his emotional isolation represented the only viable response to the complexity of genuine human connection. The declaration was formal and absolute, articulating his vow never to marry again, never to permit another individual to matter sufficiently to constitute threat to his carefully constructed distance. He did not read it aloud. Instead, he simply released it into the flames, watching as the paper blackened and curled, as ink dissolved into ash, as a commitment that had defined his previous decades surrendered to fire and ceased to exist in any physical form. Catherine stood beside him as they observed the destruction together, and no words were required to mark the significance of the moment. "I should inform you," James said quietly as the final embers of the document settled into the fireplace, "that my solicitor has completed his investigation of the materials Cecilia presented to me. The correspondence Eleanor maintained with another individual has been secured and placed under seal. Cecilia was confronted privately regarding her extortion attempts. She has been offered a choice between facing legal consequences for her actions or accepting voluntary exile to a property in Scotland, removed from the centers of society where her influence might be exerted. Catherine understood the implications of his communication. Lady Cecilia, having failed to successfully manipulate events toward her preferred outcomes, had been neutralized through mechanisms that preserved the Duke's reputation while eliminating her capacity to inflict further damage. What did she choose? Exile, he replied. She departed Ravensfield yesterday evening. I suspect she will spend the remainder of her years in considerable frustration regarding her inability to control circumstances that extend beyond her direct reach. He turned from the fireplace to face Catherine directly. Marcus, meanwhile, has withdrawn his legal contests without explanation. His solicitor suggested that his interest in challenging my authority has been substantially reduced now that the foundation for his accusations has proven unable to sustain scrutiny. Catherine found herself experiencing the peculiar sensation of release that accompanied resolution. The antagonists who had positioned themselves against them had been neutralized, not through romantic grand gestures, but through practical engagement with the mechanisms through which society functioned. The story she had anticipated would define her life had been rewritten through deliberate action, rather than passive acceptance of circumstance. 6 months later, the library at Ravensfield Manor had transformed into something approximating the space Catherine had first encountered years prior, yet fundamentally altered through the addition of her own contributions. Books she had acquired during her residence in Europe occupied shelves alongside James's personal collection. Documents they had reviewed together remained organized in systems they had developed in collaboration. The room had become genuinely shared space rather than the territory of a solitary individual. They sat together near the windows as autumn light painted the gardens in shades of amber and gold. Catherine was occupied with correspondence regarding the Ashworth property, which they had determined to restore gradually as a summer residence rather than permit it to continue its decline into complete disrepair. James was reviewing agricultural reports from their estates, though he seemed considerably more inclined toward conversation than concentrated attention. Evelyn Vance had recently written to inform them that she was expecting a child in spring, suggesting that domesticity was expanding throughout their circle of intimates. Sir Henry had arrived at Ravensfield the previous week for an extended stay, and Catherine had observed with satisfaction the depth of friendship between the two men, a connection that James had permitted to atrophy during his years of isolation, but was now actively nourishing. I have been contemplating the future, James remarked, setting aside his documents. Not with the fear that characterized my previous approach to temporal progression, but with something approximating genuine anticipation. Catherine looked up from her own papers, and he continued without requiring response. I spent 10 years determining that the future belonged to others, that my role was merely to exist without disrupting the carefully controlled parameters of my life. I did not anticipate that genuine connection would render such careful isolation simultaneously suffocating and ultimately obsolete. She reached across the space between them and placed her hand upon his. The gesture was simple, yet it contained the entirety of what they had constructed together. Not romance in the abstract sense that society celebrated, but something far more durable. Partnership, understanding. The quiet recognition that two individuals had chosen to build something genuine in opposition to every pressure that suggested such construction was inadvisable. Outside, rain had begun to fall against the windows in the manner that characterized English autumn, and the library felt simultaneously like shelter and like the center of everything that mattered. Neither spoke further, content instead to exist in the comfortable silence that only emerges when two people have moved beyond the necessity of constant articulation into the realm of genuine understanding.